Hey, 1102 class, Dr. Masters again. I am coming to you live today from UWG's Noonan campus where I teach one of my classes. It's actually it's a lovely day and it's actually it's a very pretty little campus here. Um, so this is going to be the third lecture of four on Parable of the Sower. In the first lecture, I talked about thematic elements, and I listed a couple: fire, and the predominance of fire imagery throughout the novel, from her first dream to that conflagration that chases them up the road as they're trying to make their way to Bancole's parcel of land. You have walls. You have hyperempathy syndrome. And thematic elements are all concrete things that you can point to in the text. They're not sort of guesses, they're not opinions at this point. You're saying, this is a significant, small piece of this novel that if you investigate this small piece, you can understand the novel as a whole. And that's what analysis is. It's breaking things down into smaller parts and then reassembling them together in a meaningful way that allows you to say, this is important. I have a thesis about this. Here's where your opinion comes in. That's what do we do with these thematic elements? Why pair two of them together in the way that you're going to do in your first papers? Everybody's going to be writing on Parable of the Sower for your second papers, and each of you are going to be choosing two specific thematic elements, all on your own, that you think connect together. And if we analyze those two things, how they compare, how we might contrast them, that you can come to a larger formulation of part of the novel's overall meaning, or all of its overall meaning if you've got a really awesome paper. My second lecture was on the first half of what I call, in its umbrella kind of sense, narrative structure, the narrative structure and design. These are the way that the novelist constructs the novel by giving it a certain sense of time and a timeline. And I gave you 4 registers that you need to have, more or less memorized for your first papers, because everybody's going to be writing a little bit in your introduction about the importance of narrative structure in terms of the paper that you're writing. So first and foremost is simply, when was the novel written? And then part of that too is, when was it published? Now, usually we like to think of these things as happening pretty close together. You finish the novel, you send it to your publisher, they publish it that year, maybe the following year. But sometimes we know that a novelist or a writer might put a thing aside and say, I don't really want to publish this during my lifetime. But after they die, they say, yeah, sure, you guys can read this novel now. I just didn't want to deal with it while I was still alive. It's called it's being posthumously, or after death, that it's published. But for Octavia Butler, it's quite simple. She wrote the novel in the early 90s. She wrote a sequel to it, actually, in the later 90s, called Parable of the Talents. And that this novel comes out, check the copyright on your book, I think it's 1993, but I might be a year off there. So that's important, that this work is constructed in the early 90s, and then we need to think about setting. When is it set? And in our case, she sets it 30 years in the future of when it was produced, which happens to be our very time right now. I believe it starts in 2025. You'd look this up. You need to know it. Over how many years does the narrative span from within the journal format that the novel is structured around? The third register that I talked about is a narrative's present tense. And with a journal, as I explained, that's quite simple. When does it start? When does it end? But then we need to keep in mind plot structure, which is the fourth element. In what order are the events of the novel put together? Are there flashbacks? Are there flash forwards? Do we remain completely locked into the present tense? So, for instance, a story like Popular Mechanics, the one where the couple pulls the baby apart at the end, we can say this is a story that takes place over the course of about 15 minutes or so. And so the opening action is the man in the story packing his stuff, and then they fight over first a picture frame, then they start to fight over the baby, and then they really start to fight over the baby. So that's a narrative's present tense, the amount of time that it spans in the character's sort of present moment. Plot structure involves how those events are presented to us as readers. And I explained that in the previous video. So the other half of this is, of course, and I'm sure you're wondering, okay, well, where does like the narrative's perspective from, how are we seeing these events that occur over time? And so point of view is the one side of it that we're kind of taught about. Is it a first person I telling the novel, or is it a third person, someone who's standing outside and is either can sometimes be a character kind of figure in the novel, or it is purely, again, if we go back to Popular Mechanics, it's purely objective. It's almost like there's a camera on the wall and it's just recording what happens. So we don't know anything about the character's past. There's no flashbacks, right? We get very little other than what they do and what they say. And the other half, there's kind of two halves to narrative voice, or narrative perspective, is you got the point of view on the one hand, and then you've got narrative voice on the other. And this has more to do with not simply the perspective from which the narrative or the story or this novel is being told from, but it's also the voice that these events are related to us. For example, are there tons of metaphors and similes? Is it a very poetic language? Is it very plain and stripped down, like in those two Raymond Carver stories that I had you read? And then you'll have to ask yourself, okay, Parable of the Sower, it's a first-person narrative that's presented to us as if it were a journal. So that's a huge part of it, right? It's a first-person narrator, but we need more information than that. The first-person narrator is very much locked into her present tense, right? She writes at the end of each day, or sometimes she can't get to it right away because, they're fighting off bad guys or whatever. And we see that it's dated a week after those events happened, and she's going back. Now, why is this important? So if that's our narrative perspective, we also have to consider her Earthseed verses. Those are also part of the perspective as well. There's this kind of text that's also running alongside, and that in fact begins each journal entry. When we look at voice, we're primarily starting to think about the texture and the tone of the language. It's poetics is a kind of fancier word to say that. And we can see from a journal it's very straightforward. She doesn't use a lot of flowery language. She's telling us what happened. So now if we drift this back into narrative structure, these things are so interrelated, right? So thematically, we could think about her journal as a thematic element simply because it's an object that she has to carry around with her, right? Another key thematic element is that of literacy itself, the importance of reading and writing in the novel. And in order to really think through that theme, you have to think about, well, this theme of writing and literacy is so important because a lot of characters don't have it. We're set in the future, but it's like we're living 200 years in the past, and she keeps making references to that. Another thematic element, of course, is this kind of dystopian slavery that's grown up in the future. Sorry, there's someone revving their Harley out here, which is brilliant, of course. All right, well, that's 10 minutes. So there you have narrative perspective and narrative voice as the other sort of or narrative point of view. Narrative voice is all part of narrative perspective. Okay, I will come back at you with a fourth lecture that will sort of bring all these different units together and talk about what I'm expecting from your next paper, the assignment of which I'm about to post here by the end of the week. Okay. And as you're working on that, I will get your papers back to you, so you will have some feedback from me on things you can work on in terms of your writing that you can then apply to your second papers. Okay.